We serve a loving God, right? So what does he do when we fall away? How does God act? What steps does he take? Last week we talked about the fall and what sin really is at its core. It's forsaking God and putting ourselves upon the throne of our heart rather than having him on the throne of our heart. That's what we talked about last week. But what does God do when that happens? Hey guys, my name is Andrew and welcome to this week's Sabbath School Short, where we'll be talking about that very thing by looking at lesson number 3, which is titled Cain and His Legacy. And the memory text for this week is Genesis chapter 4, verse 7, and it says this: "If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it." We're looking at Genesis chapter 4 with the story of Cain and Abel, and we're going to pick out two very important ideas, two very important things that the lesson brings out, and drive home really what God does when we fall away, when we sin, what God does on our behalf. And let's start by looking at Monday's lesson, which is titled The Two Offerings. And the quote that jumped out at me there, it says, "It was an act of open disobedience. In contrast to the attitude of his brother, often this story has been viewed as a classic case of salvation by faith, Abel and his blood offering, in contrast to an attempt to earn salvation by works, Cain and his fruit of the ground." Genesis chapter 4 talks about Abel bringing the sacrifice that God desires, right? That blood sacrifice, while Cain openly disobeys God and brings only the fruit offering. And as the quote says, this was an open act of disobedience to God because God had laid out a framework of how the sacrificial system was to work, and Cain openly rebelled against it. And this is what the interesting thing is. I really like what the lesson talks about here, how this is actually a contrast between salvation by faith and salvation by works. When you think of the sacrificial system, many people have said and how the Old Testament is a God of salvation by works, and then you go to the New Testament and it's a God of salvation by faith. It's two different gods, and that's far from the truth. You see, the sacrificial system actually is a display of salvation by faith. Why? Because you had to trust in the system that God had put in place. You had to trust this system that God laid out that said, hey, this is what you must do to be free from sin. This is what you must do to escape the condemnation of sin. This is how you have to do it. And the people's job was to trust in the instructions that God had given to them. And not only trust in those instructions, but also to trust that God would do what he said he would do. It's one thing for me to bring my lamb and sacrifice it and trust in the system, but it's another thing to trust that God is actually going to wipe away my sin if I do this. You have to trust him completely in that. And that's where the faith component of the sacrificial system comes in. Salvation has been by faith all along. Since the very beginning, salvation has been by faith. But the issue was that Abel trusted in the system that God had placed out and brought the proper sacrifice and trusted that God would do what he said he would do, while Cain decided, once again, the core of sin, that I can just take this instead. I don't have to trust the instructions that God gave to me. I can do it my own way. The core of sin, removing God off the throne of your heart and putting yourself on the throne. And that manifests itself in many different avenues. It manifests itself in many different ways. And for Cain, it was an open rebellion against the sacrificial system that God had put in place. And so, he disobeys God, attempting to earn his salvation by his own works, right? But that's not the plan that God laid out. And the beautiful news is that God has laid out a plan for us today for salvation. It's not a sacrificial system anymore because Jesus Christ has fulfilled that. And God has given us very clear instructions that say, hey, your salvation is found in him alone. Put your faith in Jesus Christ. That's our instruction for today, to allow him to sit upon the throne of our hearts, to trust him with our lives. But still, how does this answer the question, right? What does God do when we fail? What does God do when we sin, right? Well, let's look at Tuesday's lesson, which is titled The Crime. And the quote that jumped out at me there says, "As with Adam, God asks questions. Not because he doesn't know the answers, but because he wants Cain to look at himself and then understand the reason for his own condition. As always, the Lord seeks to redeem his fallen people, even when they openly fail him. This is so important to understand. In Genesis chapter 4, as Cain fails, he kills Abel, right? In the story in Genesis chapter 4, he kills Abel. God comes to him. He asks him questions. Where is your brother Abel? Just like when Adam and Eve fell, God came looking for them. He said, where are you? It's not that God doesn't know. These questions are an open invitation for self-reflection, to take a look at what you have done, for them to take a look at what they had done and to realize I messed up, and maybe provide an opportunity for them to accept responsibility for their own mistakes. But as the case we talked about a few weeks ago with Adam and Eve, instead of accepting responsibility that they had messed up, they started to blame each other. And in this story as well with Cain and Abel, Cain does not accept responsibility for his actions. Am I my brother's keeper? Right? That's what he says. Not accepting any kind of responsibility for what he did. And the crazy thing about it is, even then, God still is actively attempting to redeem them. And this is the beautiful thing about us today. And this is how this message translates to us today. This is the beautiful thing. When we fail, when we walk away from God, when we choose to not follow him, when we mess up, we're trying to follow him, but we mess up, God is in the constant search always to redeem us. God is in the constant search to bring us back to the place where he originally had us in the Garden of Eden, where humanity first was born. God is constantly trying to bring back the new life, the power of the gospel message into our lives, even when we fail him, even when we fall. This truth stands that God is in the business of saving lives, not taking them, saving lives. God is in the business of redeeming lives. The rest of the Sabbath School lesson talks about the punishment that Cain did receive. Cain was to go out into the world. But God, in his mercy, still put some sort of mark on him to protect him as he journeyed out away from everything, from his family and everything. He had to journey out and away. God put, in his mercy, put this seal on him to protect him. Even in the midst of his punishment, God still provides mercy. And this is the thing about it too, because if God were to punish us for our sins fully, we would not be alive here today. But the good news is that the reason why we are breathing and the reason why we're still standing here is because of the mercy of God. It's because he loves us and has chosen not to condemn us, because he's in the business, once again, of redeeming lives. So I want to encourage you with that message today. And I think the Sabbath School lesson does a really good job of highlighting this fact. That you and I, we rebel against God every single day. Our natural disposition, our natural tendencies, desires are to rebel against God. But even in the midst of our rebellion, God is there, seeking to redeem us. And these two stories paint how. He asks them questions for a moment of self-reflection. God comes to us, I believe, and does the same thing for us today and says, hey, I really want you to think about this. Look at what has taken place. Look at what has happened. See how you have removed me off the throne of your heart and put yourself on? How did that happen? What happened? This is a God who wants a relationship with us, who wants to talk about these things and to work them out and to bridge the gap so that we may be closer with him. So I encourage you to do a lot of self-reflection. At the end of the day, don't just get home and click on the TV or bust out a book or whatever it may be. Take a moment of self-reflection to think about your day. What happened? Were there moments in your day when you let yourself sit upon the throne of your heart? How did that go? What about the times when you did allow God to sit upon the throne of your heart? How did that go? Think about these things, and in thinking about these things, we can learn how we have been interacting with God throughout the day, and we can improve on allowing God to sit upon the throne of our hearts, and his mercy and grace empower us to keep moving forward in our relationship with him. And that is some good news, because our God is in the business of saving lives.